Before we start, if you enjoy the story, please leave a like and check if you're subscribed. Pain arrived first, then awareness, then the sensation of being lifted. Owen's consciousness surfaced through layers of agony that mapped his body in precise detail. 3 cracked ribs on his left side, probable concussion, lacerations across his right forearm where the pod's hull had peeled open like fruit skin. His training catalogued injuries with automatic efficiency even as his mind struggled to place himself in space and time. The reconnaissance pod, the atmospheric entry failure, the jungle canopy rising to meet him at terminal velocity. He should be dead. Instead, massive hands cradled him with impossible gentleness, and a vibration he felt in his bones rattled his teeth. The sensation bypassed his ears entirely, resonating through his ribcage and skull, and his eyes snapped open to fragmented darkness pierced by moonlight. The face above him defied comprehension. Crimson skin caught the pale light and seemed to hold it, glowing faintly like coals banked for morning. Golden eyes reflected the moon with predatory brightness, pupils contracting as they tracked his sudden movement. The face was angular and strong, unmistakably feminine despite its strangeness, framed by black hair that fell in heavy waves past shoulders broader than any human's. 2 curved ivory tusks protruded from a lower jaw set in concentration, and Owen's pilot mind screamed a single word: predator. He tried to thrash, but her grip adjusted without tightening, absorbing his panic with the same careful control. His cracked ribs protested, and he gasped, vision whiting out, and when it cleared, she'd shifted him against her chest where her heartbeat thundered slow and steady against his spine. She moved through the jungle with purpose, her footfalls nearly silent despite her size. Owen caught glimpses between waves of pain, dense undergrowth parting before her, vines hanging like curtains, bioluminescent flowers painting her crimson skin in shades of blue and green. She had to be 3 meters tall, maybe more, and the play of muscle beneath her skin spoke of strength that could crush him accidentally. Her minimal leather armor creaked softly with each stride, decorated with bone charms that clicked against her bracers. His mind cycled through possibilities with desperate speed. Intelligent tool user, bipedal, humanoid enough to suggest parallel evolution or ancient seeding. The subsonic vibration continued, and he realized it came from her, some form of communication or perhaps echolocation. His fingers twitched toward the emergency beacon that should have been on his suit's collar, but his suit was torn open and the beacon was gone, probably scattered across kilometers of jungle floor. She began climbing, and Owen's stomach dropped as she scaled a sheer cliff face with him still cradled in one arm. Her free hand found holds he couldn't see in the darkness, and her feet gripped stone with toes that articulated independently. The drop below yawned into shadows, and he forced himself still, acutely aware that struggling now meant death regardless of her intentions. The cave mouth appeared suddenly, a darker shadow against dark stone, and she ducked inside with him. Firelight bloomed as she passed through an entrance tunnel, and Owen glimpsed a space larger than he'd expected. High ceiling, woven mats covering smooth stone, clay vessels arranged with deliberate care. The air smelled of mineral and smoke and something green he couldn't identify. She laid him on the mats with that same impossible gentleness, and her golden eyes caught the firelight as she knelt beside him. Up close, he could see the patterns in her skin, darker burgundy striations that followed the lines of her musculature, almost artistic in their symmetry. Her face hovered above his, studying, and he realized with cold clarity that he had no idea what she saw when she looked at him. Prey? Curiosity? Threat? Owen tried to push himself up, and pain lanced through his torso. He collapsed back with a choked sound, and her hand moved toward his face. He flinched, but she didn't stop, and when her fingers touched his forehead, the world shifted. Calm flooded through him like warm water, drowning his panic beneath something that felt artificial but effective. His racing heart slowed. His breathing deepened. The pain remained, but lost its sharp edge, becoming distant and manageable. Her touch carried a faint electric tingle, and he understood with scientific detachment that she was manipulating his nervous system somehow, dampening his fight-or-flight response through direct contact. She withdrew her hand and reached for something beyond his field of vision. returning with a clay bowl filled with paste that smelled of minerals and crushed plants. Her fingers dipped into the mixture and moved toward his torn arm, and this time he didn't fight as she began spreading the salve across his lacerations. It stung briefly, then numbed, and she worked with focused efficiency, her subsonic humming a constant presence that vibrated through his chest where he lay against the mat. Owen watched her work and tried to think tactically. The cave had one entrance that he could see. The cliff below was climbable for her, but suicide for him in his condition. She moved between tending his injuries and standing watch at the cave mouth, scanning the jungle canopy with an intensity that suggested she was watching for something specific. Her tusks gleamed when she turned her head, catching firelight, and he noticed how she tasted the air with small motions of her jaw. When she returned to check his ribs, her hands pressed carefully against his sides, feeling for breaks with a precision that spoke of anatomical knowledge. Her touch was warm and dry, and when she found the cracks, she made a low sound, not quite a growl, lower and more complex, that he interpreted as concern. She didn't try to bind them, which suggested she understood enough about human physiology to know that modern practice discouraged it, or perhaps her species healed differently. Night deepened, and Owen's exhaustion pulled at him despite his situation. His captor, his savior, added wood to the fire and settled near the entrance, her back against stone, her golden eyes reflecting flames. She looked toward him once, and their gazes met across the space. He saw intelligence there, clear and assessing, and something else he couldn't name. Not hunger, not threat. Curiosity. The realization should have comforted him, but it left him more unsettled than before. He'd trained for first contact scenarios, spent years studying xenobiology protocols, but all his preparation assumed humanity would be the discoverer, not the discovered. The power dynamic was inverted, and he was completely dependent on the goodwill of a being whose motivations he couldn't begin to guess. He must have dozed, because he woke to clicking sounds rising from the jungle below, and the subsonic hum cut off abruptly. His captor's posture shifted instantly, her entire body transforming into something coiled and ready. She positioned herself between Owen and the entrance, and in the firelight, her crimson form became a weapon of focused intention, her muscles defined with predatory clarity. The clicking grew louder, multiple sources converging. Owen dragged himself upright despite his ribs screaming protest, his pilot instincts overriding pain. If she was preparing to fight, whatever was coming was worse than her. The first creature crested the cave entrance with chittering mandibles and 6 legs that gripped stone with hooked claws. It was roughly wolf-sized, covered in dark armored plating, and its eyeless head tracked movement through some other sense. Behind it, more shapes appeared in the entrance. She moved like lightning given form, her strike crushing the first creature's carapace with a sound like breaking pottery. 2 more surged past her, and Owen grabbed the nearest object, a stone the size of his fist, and swung hard into mandibles that snapped toward his throat. The impact jarred his arm, but the creature reeled back, and she was there instantly, her hand closing around its armored body and hurling it into the entrance where it collided with its packmates. The fight lasted seconds but felt eternal, and when the clicking sounds retreated down the cliff face, Owen stood with his makeshift weapon still raised, breathing hard, blood pounding in his ears. She turned from the entrance, and their eyes met across the firelit space. For the first time since waking in her arms, Owen saw her clearly, not as predator, not as captor, as protector. And in her golden eyes, he saw the exact moment she recognized the same thing in him, both survivors, both fighters, both willing to face down death for reasons neither could yet articulate. Owen's recovery progressed through a vocabulary of gesture and necessity that bypassed language entirely. Kale brought him fibrous roots that looked inedible, demonstrated by biting into one herself and chewing slowly, her golden eyes never leaving his face as she waited. He watched the mechanics of her jaw, the way her tusks didn't impede her eating, and understood this was trust offered in its most basic form. He took the root and bit down. It tasted like earth and something faintly sweet, and her subsonic hum returned, lower and gentler than before. The days blurred into routine. She changed his bandages with practiced efficiency, the herbal salve working faster than anything in his medkit would have managed. His ribs knit cleanly, his lacerations closed without infection, and his strength returned in increments he measured by how far he could move around the cave without his vision graying. She brought him water in hollowed gourds and watched him drink with an intensity that made him self-conscious, as though she was cataloging every human behavior for future reference. On the fourth morning, she gestured for him to follow her to the cave entrance. He moved carefully, his ribs still tender, and found her crouched at the cliff's edge with dawn breaking across the canopy below. She pointed downward, then swept her arm across the vertical landscape and touched his shoulder. Warmth flooded through the contact point, accompanied by images that formed directly in his mind. Predators prowling the jungle floor, safety in the heights, territorial markers carved into stone. Her touch carried meaning the way his datapad carried information, bypassed verbal processing entirely. Stay high, stay alive. Owen looked at the symbols carved into the cliff face nearby. Geometric patterns that repeated with variations, clearly deliberate. Territory markers, he realized, and probably more. A written language his people hadn't detected because they'd never thought to look at cliff faces in uncharted jungle worlds. He reached toward one carving, stopping just short of touching it, and glanced at her. She nodded once, and he traced the grooves with his fingertips, feeling how they'd been cut with precision tools. She made a pleased sound, subsonic but readable in the way it resonated through his chest, and he understood she was glad he recognized intelligence when he saw it. Their communication evolved through practical cooperation. She crafted tools in the afternoon light while he watched, studying how she lashed bone points to wooden shafts with braided vine that she treated with something sticky and strong. He noticed the inefficiency in her knotwork, functional but using more material than necessary, and gestured for the shaft. She handed it over with visible curiosity, and he demonstrated a timber hitch that held just as securely with half the vine. Her golden eyes widened fractionally, and she took the tool back to test its strength. When the binding held, she looked at him with what he was learning to read as reassessment. Her fingers touched his hand briefly, and approval flowed through the contact like sunlight. That evening she brought him to meet her tribe. Owen followed her down carved steps in the cliff face to a wider shelf where firelight illuminated perhaps 40 individuals moving through the space with the fluid coordination of long familiarity. Conversation stopped when Kale appeared with him at her side. Crimson faces turned toward them, golden eyes catching the light, and Owen felt his pulse spike under the weight of that collective attention. Most stood at Kale's height or near it, their skin tones ranging from deep red to burgundy, patterning unique to each individual. Children, smaller but still taller than him, peered from behind adults with unguarded curiosity. A male stepped forward, leaner than Kale but built for endurance, his darker crimson skin marked with ritual scarring across his chest. His tusks were longer, more pronounced, and when he made a subsonic challenge that blurred Owen's vision with pressure, he understood this was territorial dominance being asserted. His knees weakened, and he gritted his teeth, refusing to step back. Kale moved between them before Owen could fall, and her responding rumble made the air vibrate hard enough that dust fell from the cave ceiling. The male, Soran, Owen would learn later, held his ground for 3 seconds before his posture shifted fractionally, conceding. Kale's hand found Owen's shoulder, steadying him, and the residual warmth of her touch cleared his blurred vision. An elder approached, her skin weathered to deep burgundy, her hair shot through with silver. She studied Owen for a long moment, then extended both hands. Kale's fingers squeezed his shoulder once, reassurance or warning he couldn't tell, and he stepped forward to meet the elder's touch. Her hands closed around his forearms and the world inverted. Memories flooded through him in reverse. The crash, months of solo reconnaissance work, the loneliness of deep space, his sister's funeral, the corporate recruiter's promises, childhood in the agricultural domes, every significant moment of his life passing before the elder's examination like files being accessed. He felt exposed in a way no interrogation had ever achieved, vulnerable down to his core, and when she finally released him, he staggered. Her expression carried something like approval mixed with sorrow, and she made a gesture toward Kale that Owen interpreted as permission or perhaps acceptance. The tribe resumed their evening activities, though many still watched him with wary distance. Children were called back from approaching him. Soran kept his position near the fire, arms crossed, radiating disapproval that needed no translation. Owen found purpose 3 days later when he noticed their water pulley system jamming. The mechanism was ingenious, counterweighted gourds on braided vine running through bone pulleys, but one pulley had cracked and was catching on every cycle. He gestured to ask permission, and Kale brought him to examine the system. He spotted the problem immediately, explained through gesture that they needed to redistribute the weight, and spent an afternoon modifying the configuration using leverage principles his engineering training had made second nature. When the system ran smoothly again, the tribe's attitude toward him shifted measurably. He caught grateful nods, fewer hostile stares. One of the children left him a carved bone figure that night, a crude representation of a human, which he treasured more than gold. Kale watched him work with an intensity that made his hands unsteady. He felt her presence like a physical weight, the way her shadow fell across him when she stood behind him, how his pulse responded to her proximity. She was studying him, he knew, but the attention felt different now, less like observation and more like something he had no framework to process. During a rare moment when the tribe had dispersed for hunting and gathering, Kale found him at the cave entrance watching the canopy. She sat beside him, her size making him feel both protected and small, and after a long silence, she reached for his hand. He let her take it, his heart hammering as she guided his palm to her face. Her skin was warm and smooth, the texture finer than he'd expected. He traced the strong line of her jaw, felt the slight roughness where her burgundy patterns darkened, the curve of her cheekbone. Her eyes closed, and through the contact point, emotions flooded into him. Protectiveness, curiosity, a warmth that had no English word but felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When he didn't pull away, her eyes opened and held something like wonder. His thumb brushed near her tusk, and she made a sound, barely audible, that vibrated through his palm. He froze, but she leaned fractionally into the touch, and Owen understood he was being trusted with something profound. His other hand rose of its own accord, mirroring the touch on her other side, framing her face, and her golden eyes reflected him in miniature, small and fragile and somehow precious. The moment shattered as engines screamed overhead. Owen jerked back, his head snapping upward as corporate shuttles tore through the atmosphere, their hull plating still glowing from re-entry. Kale surged to her feet, her subsonic challenge rattling his bones, and he saw betrayal flood across her face as broadcast speakers boomed his identification codes across the jungle, demanding his return. She looked at him with those golden eyes, and Owen saw everything they'd built fracture in real time. Her people emerged from the cave network, staring at the sky where human ships painted the canopy with targeting lasers, and Kale stood between her tribe and him like she couldn't decide which way to face. His people had brought violence to her hidden world, and Owen had led them here. Soran's demand cut through the chaos before Owen could speak. The scarred hunter gestured violently toward the jungle, his subsonic challenge directed at Owen, but his eyes fixed on Kale, and the tribe's elders gathered with expressions that needed no translation. The human had brought destruction. The human must leave. Kale stood between them, her posture rigid with conflict, and Owen watched her golden eyes track between her people and him. He understood what she was being asked to choose, understood that everything they'd built meant nothing against centuries of isolation kept sacred for exactly this reason. The corporate ships established a perimeter camp visible through breaks in the canopy, their machinery already clearing landing zones, and he knew with sick certainty that they weren't here for a simple extraction. "I never sent a distress signal," Owen said, knowing she couldn't understand the words but needing to say them anyway. He touched his chest, then pointed at the ships, shaking his head. Her eyes narrowed, reading his body language, and he gestured to indicate something separate from himself. The pod, the black box, the automated beacon that would have activated on crash impact regardless of his wishes. She studied him for a long moment while her tribe waited, then turned to Soran and made a series of gestures accompanied by subsonic tones that Owen felt more than heard. The scarred hunter's expression darkened, but he didn't challenge her directly. The elders conferred, their touches carrying rapid communication, and finally the eldest made a sharp gesture that seemed to grant Kale temporary authority over the situation. The mining operation began at dawn. Owen stood at the cliff's edge with Kale and watched heavy equipment tear into the jungle where his pod had crashed. The machinery moved with industrial efficiency, stripping away vegetation and excavating the mineral-rich soil his reconnaissance scan had flagged. Game animals fled the noise, their panicked movement visible from the heights, and Kale's hand tightened on the stone beside her until her knuckles paled. He'd done this. His mission had been routine survey work, catalog potential resource sites for future development, and he'd filed his report automatically before the atmospheric failure. The crash had only accelerated a timeline that would have brought corporate interests here eventually, but the distinction felt meaningless, watching Kale's hunting grounds disappear beneath treads and excavators. "I can stop this," Owen said, turning to face her. He pointed to himself, then the camp, then made a pushing-away gesture. Her golden eyes tracked his movements, understanding growing in her expression, but she shook her head sharply and grabbed his arm. The argument that followed was their first real attempt at complex communication. Owen gestured insistently toward the camp, his frustration mounting as he tried to convey that he could negotiate, convince them to leave, use his authority as the downed pilot to leverage some kind of agreement. Kale's responses came through subsonic emphasis and forceful touches that carried emotional weight. Danger, refusal, protection, and her physical blocking of his path made her position clear. They stood close, both breathing hard from the effort of making themselves understood, and Owen became acutely aware of how she loomed above him, how he had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. Her hand remained on his arm, her grip gentle despite its strength, and the contact carried a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Together," he said finally, touching his chest then hers, gesturing toward the camp. Her eyes widened fractionally at the presumption, but after a moment she nodded once, sharp and decisive. They moved through the jungle at nightfall, with Kale leading. Her silent progress through terrain that would have betrayed Owen's every step made him grateful for her presence, even as he worried about leading her into danger. She read the jungle through senses he lacked, her subsonic pulses revealing obstacles in the darkness, and twice she pulled him flat against the ground seconds before automated security drones passed overhead. The perimeter fence was civilian-grade, designed to keep out animals rather than sapient infiltrators. Owen identified the sensor pattern and guided Kale through the gaps, his technical knowledge complementing her physical capabilities, and they reached the command tent's outer wall without triggering alarms. Voices carried through the synthetic fabric. "Ethical implications of displacing an intelligent species," a man said, his tone carrying academic precision. "The Valen demonstrate tool use, social organization, and what appears to be a complex language system based on subsonic frequencies. Under colonial law." "Colonial law applies to registered territories," a woman interrupted. Her voice was firm, military-trained. "This planet isn't even designated yet. We file the resource claim, extract what we need, and by the time Oversight investigates, there won't be anything left to protect." Owen felt Kale stiffen beside him. She couldn't understand the words, but tone carried meaning across species barriers, and the woman's voice left no room for misinterpretation. "You're talking about genocide," the man said. "I'm talking about eliminating complications. The mineral deposits run directly under their cliff system. We destabilize the geology, the caves collapse, and any inconvenient witnesses disappear with them. Clean, quick, and legally defensible as accidental." Kale's subsonic growl vibrated through Owen's chest, and he grabbed her arm, shaking his head urgently. She met his eyes, and he saw rage there that matched his own, but also something else, confirmation that every story her people told about sky peoples was true. They retreated into the jungle, and Owen's mind raced through implications. The extraction pattern he'd observed suddenly made horrific sense. They weren't just mining minerals. They were systematically undermining the cliff structure, and once the Valens homes collapsed, the corporation could claim ignorance about intelligent inhabitants. Kale took him deeper into her territory than he'd been before, to a cave that the tribe clearly considered sacred. The walls were covered in paintings that stretched back centuries, and along one side lay preserved artifacts, hull fragments, corroded tools, sealed containers bearing manufacturer marks from a dozen different Earth corporations. Each artifact represented a crash site, and Kale's touch memory flooded Owen with understanding as she guided his hand across them. Every contact with humans had brought death. Disease, violence, exploitation. Her people had learned to hide, to avoid the Sky Peoples at all costs, and the price of that wisdom was written in ancestral bones buried beneath painted stone. In the flickering light of her torch, Kale's crimson skin seemed darker, weighted with generations of grief. Owen reached up to touch her face, and she lowered herself to allow it, her golden eyes vulnerable in ways he'd never seen. He told her about losing his sister to corporate greed, about choosing the emptiness of space over the pain of connection, about becoming the kind of person who mapped worlds for profit without considering who might already call them home. She couldn't understand his words, but his hands trembled against her skin, and the emotion in his voice needed no translation. Her own hands came up to frame his face, dwarfing it, and they stayed that way in the sacred darkness, two refugees from their own kinds, both scarred by the same fundamental betrayal. They returned to find smoke rising from the jungle. Saran had taken 6 young hunters to sabotage the mining equipment, and corporate security had responded with automatic weapons. 2 Valen lay broken in the clearing where they'd fallen, their crimson skin darker where blood pooled beneath them, and the remaining hunters carried their bodies back while the tribe gathered in horrified silence. The keening started low, subsonic frequencies that dropped Owen to his knees with sympathetic grief. The sound built as more voices joined, and Kale's roar shook the canopy, rage and mourning braided together in a frequency that made his bones ache. Soran stood over the bodies with his scarred chest heaving, and when he looked at Owen, there was no confusion in his eyes about who bore responsibility. The fragile peace was over. The tribe fractured along fault lines as old as their painted histories. Half wanted to relocate deeper into the uncharted jungle, carrying their dead and abandoning the cliff homes their ancestors had carved over generations. The other half demanded blood, swift strikes against the human camp, guerrilla warfare that would leave no survivors to report back. Saran stood with the latter group, his scarred chest still marked with the blood of the hunters he'd carried home, and his subsonic challenges rattled through the gathering with undisguised fury. Kale stepped into the center of the circle, and silence fell. She spoke through gesture and subsonic emphasis, her words accompanied by touches to the elders that carried complex meaning Owen couldn't fully parse. He caught fragments, his own image transmitted through her touch memory, the conversation they'd overheard, the xenobiologist's protest. She was proposing something that made the elders exchange weighted looks, and when she finally pointed at Owen, he understood she was gambling everything on humanity's capacity for justice. The elders conferred, their touches rapid and forceful, and finally the eldest made a gesture that looked like reluctant permission. Saran's expression promised that if this failed, Owen wouldn't survive long enough to see the consequences. They found Dr. Voigt 2 kilometers from the main camp, cataloging plant samples with the focused intensity of someone avoiding harder thoughts. Owen and Kale approached from downwind, and when the xenobiologist turned to find a 3-meter Valen warrior standing 5 meters away, his sample case clattered to the ground. "Don't run," Owen called out, stepping from behind Kale, "and don't call for security." Voigt's eyes went wide behind his field glasses, tracking between Owen and Kale with the manic attention of a man watching his academic theories become terrifying reality. He raised his hands slowly, the universal gesture of non-aggression, and his gaze fixed on Kale with undisguised wonder. "She's beautiful," he whispered, then seemed to realize what he'd said and flushed. I mean, the adaptation to vertical terrain, the musculature distribution, the cranial ridge development suggesting subsonic communication. They're going to kill her people, Owen interrupted. The mining operation is designed to collapse the cliff system. You said it yourself. Genocide. Voight's scientific enthusiasm drained away, leaving something haunted. I have no authority to stop the extraction. I'm just here to document mineral concentrations and assess environmental impact. Then document this. Owen gestured toward Kale. Prove they're intelligent. Send it to Earth's Colonial Oversight Network. Make it impossible for the corporation to claim ignorance. Kale watched Voight with golden eyes that missed nothing, her posture ready to fight or flee, and Owen realized she was trusting him to read this human correctly. The xenobiologist stared back, and whatever he saw in her gaze made his decision. I need time, Voight said. Comprehensive documentation, multiple data streams, evidence that will survive corporate legal challenges. At least 3 days. We don't have 3 days, Owen replied, but Kale's hand on his shoulder stopped him. She'd read something in Voight's body language, some truth that transcended words, and after a moment she nodded once. Owen volunteered to return to the camp as a recovered casualty, maintaining the fiction that he'd been lost in the jungle rather than sheltered by the Valen. The separation from Kale felt like losing a limb, but it was the only way to give Voight access to the camp's communication systems without suspicion. Security Chief Mira Okafor processed his return with professional efficiency, running medical scans and asking pointed questions about his survival. Owen stuck to his rehearsed story: pod crash, injuries, disorientation, barely surviving on emergency rations while hiding from predators. She listened with an expression that suggested she believed exactly none of it, but she cleared him for light duty and assigned him to equipment maintenance. The interrogation came on the second night. Corporate officers wanted to know about indigenous populations. Had he seen any intelligent life? Were there security threats beyond natural wildlife? Owen maintained his fiction while sweat ran down his spine, acutely aware that any slip could doom both the Valen and Voight's investigation. They pressed him about the mineral deposits, the extraction timeline, and he fed them technical assessments while his mind tracked Kale's location through pure imagination. Was she safe? Was she hunting? Did she feel this absence the way he did? His hands moved unconsciously to touch his jaw where her fingers had lingered, and he forced them still before anyone noticed. Meanwhile, in the jungle, Kale led her tribe in preparation for exodus or last stand. She organized hunters into defensive positions, supervised the evacuation of children to deeper caves, and stood watch at the cliff edge where she could see the mining equipment tearing closer to her home's foundation. Soran worked beside her with grudging efficiency, but his posture radiated judgment, and she knew that if the humans' plan failed, Owen's death would be the price of her miscalculation. Her fingers pressed to her jaw where his touch had mapped her face, and the memory carried warmth that defied logic. Voight's discovery of the corporate timetable changed everything. He found Owen during a supply inventory check, his academic composure cracking, as he whispered that the destabilization sequence was scheduled to activate in 18 hours. The extraction team planned to evacuate immediately after, leaving the collapse to appear like a natural seismic event. I've transmitted the data, Voight said, but oversight response will take days, maybe weeks. By then, Mira's security team breached the supply tent before he could finish. She stood in the entrance with her weapon drawn, and her expression carried the weight of someone who'd made an irreversible choice. They found your transmissions, she said to Voight. Corporate command has ordered your arrest and the immediate execution of the destabilization sequence. They're going to bury everything, the evidence, the Valen, and anyone who knows too much. Why are you telling us this? Owen demanded. Because I signed up to protect people, not commit genocide. She lowered her weapon. I've convinced my team to stand down, but we can't stop the sequence from here. It has to be shut down manually from the mining platform's core processor. Owen's blood ran cold. The platform core was at ground level, surrounded by Bonesinger territory that the Valen avoided even during daylight. At night, it would be suicide. He signaled Kale using the emergency beacon Voight had modified, and she came through the perimeter with the terrible silence of an apex predator. Their reunion lasted only seconds, her hand on his face, his wrapped around her wrist, before they moved toward the mining site with Mira's team running interference. The jungle floor at night was exactly as nightmarish as Owen had feared. Bone singers tracked them through chemical sensing, their chittering harmonics growing louder as the pack converged. Kale fought with brutal precision, her crimson form barely visible in the darkness, while Owen navigated by the platform's lights. They lost 2 of Mira's soldiers to mandibles that struck from blind angles, and Owen's ribs screamed protest as he ducked and rolled through attacks that would have killed him instantly. Kale's body became his shield, her skin taking cuts meant for him, and he guided them through the technical maze of support struts and processing equipment while his hands shook with fear and determination. They reached the core with 90 seconds remaining on the destabilization timer. Owen's fingers flew across the interface, overriding safeties and rerouting power, while Kale stood guard against the bone singers that had followed them inside. The platform shuddered as the cliff above began to collapse, and Owen realized they'd triggered the sequence before he could complete the shutdown. The escape route disappeared under falling rock. Kale pulled him against her chest, and Owen pressed his face to her crimson skin, feeling the thunder of her heartbeat beneath his cheek. Her arms wrapped around him completely, sheltering him from the destruction, and she made a low subsonic sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his bones, a frequency that carried no ambiguity, no translation barrier. "Love." Owen's arms wrapped as far around her as they would reach, and he whispered against her skin that she'd taught him courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to trust anyway. That she'd shown him connection was worth the risk of loss. That if these were his final moments, he was grateful they were spent in her embrace. The collapse lasted 3 hours by Mira's estimate. When the rescue teams broke through, Soren's hunters and Mira's soldiers working side by side, their combined effort fueled by mutual refusal to abandon their people, they found Owen and Kale alive in a pocket of space her body had protected. She was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and he was barely conscious, but their arms were still wrapped around each other. Soren met Kale's eyes as his hunters pulled away rubble, and his expression carried something that might have been respect. The Colonial Oversight Network arrived 4 days later, their investigation ships bearing Earth Authority marks and legal jurisdiction that superseded corporate claims. Voight's documentation had been comprehensive enough to trigger immediate intervention, and the corporation faced charges that would take years to resolve. The Valan tribe voted to maintain cautious contact with humanity, allowing scientific observation and limited trade in exchange for protected territorial rights. It was a fragile peace built on bureaucratic framework, but it held because both sides had people willing to believe in it. Owen stayed. He filed his resignation with the Reconnaissance Service and took a position as cultural liaison, learning the Valan language through touch and subsonic immersion. He moved into Kale's cave, and she modified her living space to accommodate his smaller size with a tenderness that made his chest ache. They built a life together that defied every logical boundary, her teaching him to hunt in the canopy, him showing her the mathematics of stellar navigation, both learning that love required no translation when trust ran deep enough. On clear nights, they sat at the cliff edge and watched ships cross the sky. His hand would find hers, and the contact would carry everything. Words couldn't. Gratitude, wonder, and the earned certainty that they'd chosen each other not despite the impossible distance between their species, but because of the courage it took to cross it.